Okay, so we're going to talk about the Ceratopsia. So the Ceratopsia are some of the more iconic of the dinosaur members for sure. These are really classically dinosaurian, right? Very neat animals. Animals that are of the size of medium to large size African African mammals that are alive today, in many cases, but other members that are actually much smaller, even down to the size of things like a dog, maybe. So there is a fair range of sizes within these guys. But these things, I think, really come across as very primeval, very different, and very cool. And I think that's great. They are very neat in their own way. So we're going to talk about these guys. Keeping in mind we're stuck down here, still we're going to spend the rest of our time just dealing with this group here. We did a little bit of work down here, right? We looked at the Pachys. Now we're going to look at the Ceratopsians. The following lecture, we're going to actually move up again, and we're going to be in the Ornithopoda, which are your duck-billed dinosaurs, which are probably one of the better known of the groups. We have a lot of data on them, and so we're going to actually break that into 2 lectures so that we have time to go through a lot of the different stuff within the Ornithopoda. Ornithopoda will not be covered in this test, so the lecture on Monday I have to give you because I couldn't just give you a day off. But you will not see any answers or questions related to it on the test. So I promise you that you will have at least a week to study the material that I give you. And then once we're actually done with Ornithopoda, we'll move into what is shown here as the more diverse grouping, but actually is only relatively probably diverse, especially because of modern lineages. But we're going to deal with sauropods, and then we're going to deal with the theropods. And the theropods are actually going to take us the most time to get through. So Ceratopsians they are very unusual in some ways. They almost always come with these enormous frills. They often have things that come off the frills. They look a lot like charging rhinos to some degree, almost always. And they are very distinctly different between species. I mean, really easy to identify just based on skull morphology, at least in the adults. Probably the juveniles, maybe not as much. But at least in the adults, they're really, really easy to identify. You see them appear in pop culture in a lot of places. Probably the most common one is Triceratops, I think, is one that people really could even identify. And if you think about it, that's actually fairly impressive. That's a genus-level name for a group of animals. You can't ask people to give you the genus-level names for even very common insects like mosquitoes, right? People will not know that off the top of the hand. But if you say a Triceratops, I know exactly what that is. And that is basically the common name, right? That's such a potent genus-level name that you can actually use it in some ways. So these animals are, I think, very attractive for a lot of reasons. And one of the other nice things about Ceratopsians is they appear relatively late in the fossil record. These are a group that really diversify in the Cretaceous. This is a group that is most diverse, most interesting, spans the largest range of sizes, fills up the most niches in the Cretaceous period. But they appeared sometime in the Jurassic, and they are therefore still an interesting group. But their fossil record in the Cretaceous is actually quite good. We have lots and lots of information about them, and we even have lots and lots of information about many of the primitive members of the group. So the ones that people actually know a lot about are Protoceratops. We'll look at some of those guys. We actually have a lot of bones of Protoceratops. We really have from hatchling to adult in Protoceratops. So we'll start the way we usually do. We'll go through some of these unifying characteristics. I don't think anyone here would ever have a problem identifying a Ceratopsian out of a crowd. It's very, very straightforward. They will almost always have an enormous frill, just absolutely outrageously large. Primitive members within the groups may just have a ring of bone around the top of their head, or it may be very small and you can almost not see it. But usually they have these giant frills. Often they will have these big flared cheeks. There are these 2 bones, right, that come out usually just below the eyes. They stick out and appear to cover the edges of the mouth, basically. Often on the snout, I should say, there's another bone now. There's a rostral bone that sticks out and forms a very sharp beak. So these guys superficially look a lot like bird beaks in some ways. They often have very, very sharply recurved beaks. So the beaks come down and form almost a C. They're so sharply curved. they also form. They also are probably covered in the live animal with keratin, and we'll talk about that as well. But those beaks are probably supporting large pieces of keratin above them. I think another very common character that you could have given me without even taking this lecture is that they often have horns, right? That's very easy to see. Not all groups do have horns. Sometimes they have these flat surfaces in place of the horns. You saw one of those at the beginning of the lecture, but we'll look at another one later on. We don't think those supported horns, so they appear very flat, and probably in the live animal they were flat. But if they did support a horn, it was probably keratin that they were supporting. Most likely they did not, though. In those cases, those big flat areas that are in place of the horns on the head are called bosses. So you may hear the term bosses used in papers if you see them. Almost never outside of the more primitive members of the group will you deal with animals that have no ornamentation on the head. They will almost always have something, whether it's horns or whether it's bones that stick out around the frill. Sometimes the frills actually fold over on themselves. Sometimes there are bones that come out of the frill. Sometimes there are horns that go out to the side. Sometimes there are additional horns around the other horns. Sometimes there are horns in the center of the frill. The frill really has diversity. But if you cut the head off and you move that away and just look at the bodies are largely recycled between groups. They're very, very similar. Again, once you get outside of those primitive members, they're all going to be quadrupedal. They're primarily going to be these big, bulky animals that are probably consuming lots of plant matter, which we have to talk about. But the back ends of the animals look the same. So that suggests some very, very distinct differences for what the head is used for versus what the back end of the animal is used for. So this is an image of just some of the diversity that we know about within this group. I also want you to be aware, and we're going to talk about this as we go in the lecture, but juveniles do not look like adults. So if you had a juvenile in hand, you wouldn't inherently know what the adult was going to look like unless you have a good age series of those animals. There's all sorts of stuff going on here, right? We've got things like horns that are actually curved, right? They actually curve down. There are some with horns that are actually curved up. There are some with single nasal horns. There are some with multiple horns. There are some with horns that spread out to the side and cover the eyes, basically. There are others that are pointed inwards. These colors are not known, but I like the idea that the artist is putting on here. I think too frequently we get obsessed with, well, what mammals look gray, they look brown. Mammals have bad eyesight, so of course they're going to look gray or brown. They don't see very much. These guys are probably going to have very good eyesight, at least color differentiation, and so colors are probably relatively important for them. So you can expect frills to be really colorful, right? Big animals that are displaying these very complex, very expensive structures are probably accentuating them with big, noticeable colors coming off of them. We haven't talked about yet appearance of dinosaurs. We're going to do that, like I said, in a later lecture. But I do just want you to appreciate that some of the stuff that we just assume to be true, especially for mammals, doesn't necessarily have to be true. Do you have a question? No. Okay. We're just waiting. There's also all sorts of cool stuff coming off the back of the frill, right? You can have these really long bones. You can have very short, stubby bones. Some of the frills are, at the edges of the frill are just smooth all the way around. Others have indentations in them. Let's see if I can find the one with the big recurved frill. Some of these, in the fossil animal, it looks like somebody melted the frill and it fell over on itself, and that is actually the natural condition. The frill actually would grow up, and then in the adult animal, the bones would bend forward and fold over on top of it. So it would actually have a frill that looks like somebody had folded the top 25% down. So there's lots of variation within these frills. Is that in the middle, top right?
No, like the second one from the...
This guy?
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. That's pretty close.
Just from the bottom middle.
Second from bottom middle.
Yeah, right. Left.
No, not these guys. You can get the idea, though. Yeah, I mean, this guy up here is closer. Those horns have folded down, so there is some of that there. But there's and again, when we have fossils, right, we have a very small percentage of the total known diversity, and so you can expect the frills would have been even more diverse within this group, right? These are very clearly diverse even within this small grouping of animals. Okay, so toucans are a very good example of an animal that uses keratin to accentuate something and to add to it. They also place in keratin lots of different coloring material, and so they get very, very colorful bills that are supported by very strong bone underneath or bone underneath. But in any case, that adds to the diversity of color and also for dinosaurs, probably adding color around the head may have been very important. That may have been a focal area for these animals to look for color, right? That seems to be relatively common within things like lizards as well. So toucan bills are probably at least an idea about how keratin can be colored. It doesn't mean that Ceratopsians had colored frills like toucans, but it should give you at least a range of possibilities. And basically, it's the rainbow, right? We can think of almost any color, keeping in mind that Ceratopsians also probably see in the UV spectrum, which you can't, so there's probably an additional color that you're not seeing here as well. A lot of birds, and we'll talk more about this in appearance, a lot of birds don't actually look like what you think they look like because they see in an additional spectrum, and the color you see is often a base color that's accentuated by another color which you're not seeing when they actually display. Again, this is another thing. For keratin, they're very often yellows and oranges, and so if the crest or the horns of Ceratopsians were covered, probably many of them were these bright yellows and oranges, so you may have seen horns that were bright yellow or bright orange. That, again, is not a surprise if the animal is using those as display objects, so you can sort of guess at some of the ranges of colors. Your book talks about an older style model of Ceratopsian evolution, and it starts by saying, okay, well, Ceratopsians invaded North America, right? These guys appear relatively late. Laurasia and North America are separate from Gondwana. They appear in Laurasia and then probably migrate at some point into North America. That was the older view where we had this very simple, there was a migration component. We think now what actually happened is that North America was invaded multiple times from Laurasia, so probably a group came over, the passageway sealed back up, a passageway opened up, a new group came over, passageway sealed back up, a new passageway opened up, a new group came over, and they kept adding to this diversity. And probably animals were going back and forth the other direction too. So it's a much more complex story than that. It's probably a back and forth, with at least one initial group starting in Laurasia and coming over at some point. So that component remains. You'll also see from this is a good example of what primitive members of the group would have looked like versus what much later members. If you look to the right here, right, so these are the more derived groups, you can see that these really appear in the late Cretaceous. So again, these are relatively late appearing groups. These animals are quadrupeds. They have very large frills. They've got horns. These are your classic Ceratopsians at this point. If you look to the left, you'll see that they start as with most dinosaur groups, they start as bipedal. They start as small animals. These, of course, because they belong to the Ornithischians, belong within an herbivorous group of radiation, so they're going to be small bipedal or herbivores. Psittacosaurus, which is, we're going to actually look at an artist reconstruction. If you can't see it on that, it has quills that come off the back of it. We actually know that they did because we have fossils now with quills off the back, and it's just the lower back. They had quills coming off the back. They don't have terribly large frills, but the head looks like somebody cut the frill off and put a Ceratopsian on a bipedal body. Again, that shouldn't be surprising. But relatively quickly, you see we go into a quadrupedal mode, and of course your classic animals like Protoceratops, right, fall out over here. But these actually appear relatively late, right? We're already deep into the Cretaceous when animals like Protoceratops are appearing. So these are really latecomers to the dinosaur scene, and unfortunately for them, they get obliterated at the end of the Cretaceous, so we don't have any modern members, right? So they do really, really well. They appear to be really diversifying, and then they hit that cutoff, and they're gone. This is a good example. It is at least an artist reconstruction of what these guys might have looked like. This is, again, one of the more primitive members of the group. What I want you to look at here, I'm going to use this little piece of chalk. What I want you to look at here is, this is where the frill would be, right, if it was a more derived member. But you can see that already elements of the bone have started to develop there, have started to create some structure around the head. You'll also notice that bone at the side of the head that comes out underneath the eye is already in place, right, and really well developed. And you can see that there are probably things starting to form around and over the eyes. There are these horns or bumps that are starting to appear there. The rest of the body is somewhat unremarkable within the dinosaur group, right? We have an animal with some arms that fall down and probably manipulate things. Look at how long these arms are already relative to the body. This animal is drawn almost in a quadrupedal stance, which it probably could have done in real life. It probably could have dropped to all fours relatively easily, gotten some plant material, maybe stood up, braced itself against a tree, gotten more plant material, and it spent most of its time probably walking around in a bipedal stance, but would have been switching back and forth regularly. In any case, we also know that they have these quills around the back. I'm not going to tell you if they're feathers or not, but we are going to talk about that when we get to appearances of dinosaurs. And then the artist here added some striping to them, which seems fine. I don't have any particular complaint about this, other than to say again that dinosaurs tend to be more colorful than we expect, probably not less colorful. So probably you should lean towards addition of color as opposed to removal of color. And at least for these guys, this is correct now. You can see the artist put a cheek in here. Absolutely correct. These guys are going to have cheeks. This is a slightly more derived member. So this is a member from Psittacosaurus from Asia. This guy is from North America, probably one of the early invaders that made it here. And apparently the young are being chased by this mammal. In any case, what you can see on this animal is, again, a very similar thing to what you saw before, but the features are slightly more pronounced. We actually have a frill here now, but the animal is still primarily bipedal with maybe some quadrupedal motion within there, and the animal is still is small. This is animal on the order of sizes of dogs, not on the order of sizes of horses, that kind of stuff. So size-wise, the smaller members are probably less than 100 pounds, relatively small animals, right on the order of small to large dogs. Advanced members are going to be much, much bigger. I mean, when you get up to the big Ceratopsians, you're talking about truly enormous animals on the order of elephant size, right? These are big animals, and they do a lot of business. These larger animals are actually fairly well known right now, so we actually think in many places that we have a lot or most of the large animals that lived in that area. The smaller animals are the ones that we're going to continue to find. So we have a fairly good idea about the diversity of large animals in certain time periods. We know relatively less about smaller animals at those time periods. Certainly the two overlap. So we had both very, very large animal Ceratopsians in the environment with smaller animals, and they're probably picking on different plant material as a result of that, or living slightly different lives to allow themselves to accommodate. The small ones are just, people haven't spent the time looking for them. It's much more attractive again to find large bones, and so those are the ones we have the most information from. By now, within the Ornithischians, we've reached some of the best chewing that we will see in any lineage to evolve. These guys are going to have far and away some of the best chewing that's ever appeared on the surface of the Earth, and it's going to be very, very obvious very quickly that these animals are moving through a lot of plant material. So they've added, of course, that additional rostral bone, which is not dissimilar from the way that early Ornithischians added a prefrontal bone right to the mouth to provide access to better biting. They have very deeply inset cheeks. You can see that here. It's so inset, as a matter of fact, that the head almost looks like you could cut the teeth and jaws away from it, and they would just fall away, and you would still have a shield actually covering on top of it. They have dental batteries, not particularly different from the Ornithopoda, so their dental batteries will evolve at least twice. These huge cornoid processes, which again are those pieces that come up off the jawbone and provide strong muscle attachments for chewers, right? They provide large muscle areas so you can get really strong muscles and chew frequently. And of course the jaws are really strongly inset. So there's no question, we had a lot of questions about some of the other groups, right? That are they really chewing, or are they just capturing food and then crushing it a bit and sending it back? These guys are going to spend their day picking plant material, chewing the plant material, moving it into the body. Picking plant material, chewing the plant material, moving it into the body. Whether they're doing it like ruminants, where they actually cough the food back up and chew again, or not, that we don't necessarily know that. But they are certainly going through a lot of chewing time. So they're probably spending large components of their day actually sitting and physically chewing the material within their mouth. And you can also see that here, right? We have a nipping part up front, that big open area in between, and then we get to the dental battery. So we've really set them up for chewers. This is not a Ceratopsian tooth at the bottom. I'm just putting it up there for comparison. The one at the top is, however, what we call a dental battery. You've not really seen this before per se, but this is what it looks like in Ornithischians. What actually happens is that there are so many teeth growing together, they're erupting from the lower portion of the jaw, that they look like one single tooth, and they basically function like that in the sense that they shear at the top, so that's where the teeth would meet, and they abrade one another, and as they're doing that, they're cutting and masticating the food material. This is an example of those teeth, so if you actually look at them, what you'd see is that they are each wearing at slightly different rates. So just below each tooth, another tooth is coming in. So as a tooth is lost, another tooth just comes in. And the whole root is actually pushed up through the jaw, and that wears out and gets removed from that. So you have the actual cutting point up front, that wears out, and another one is right behind it. This is actually a mastodon molar, but I just want to give you an idea of the kind of space and size of these things, right? These are big animals, and they're doing a lot of chewing. This is another very large animal that does a lot of chewing, and so both of them have these enormously broad surfaces of which they can actually access and crush plant material upon. Dental batteries, at least for early groups, tend to move from a horizontal, so they tend to sit, instead of being flat across in a horizontal plane, they tend to tilt and become more and more vertical with time. Your book, sometimes your book does things, I suspect it is probably personal opinion more than related to any particular paper. But your book says that that's likely inexplicable. But actually, if you look at the amount of cross-sectional area you get with horizontal chewing versus vertical chewing, so if you have a horizontal surface, right, and you just turn it vertically, you actually have just physically more chewing room along that vertical axis than you would in a horizontal plane. So it may be that the vertical plane allows them to get a little more bite every time they're coming down. They're getting slightly more length across the two teeth across one another, and that probably increases that mastication efficiency. That's what I would argue is probably going on, since it seems to be a general trend throughout the group that you have primitive members with more horizontal, and as you move on, you get into these more and more vertical teeth. Whether that's the case or not, certainly we don't yet know. Right? We don't actually yet know that. But that is, at least to my mind, the simplest explanation, since these guys have so much to do with chewing. Primitive members, actually, if you find them, we can find them with gastroliths in their gut cavity, so they are clearly not spending as much time chewing. And it's not until you get into the later members where chewing becomes more and more predominant that you end up you can't find gastroliths, which makes sense, right? If an animal spends its time chewing, it doesn't need gastroliths to crush food, right? So it's not using them in that case. And so they've moved that component of the gut away, and they've migrated that need into the mouth, right? So what you have to do now is do it in the mouth, and that may save them on things like having to look for rocks. It may allow them to chew more plant material. It may also save them on volume within the gut, right? Now they can donate more gut volume to actual crushed plant material and spend more time extracting energy from it. The body on these guys is generally fairly large, especially for the later groups, but it's not swollen like some of the other things we saw, like the Ankylosaurus, that actually looked like somebody had squished it, right, and made the ribs expand really far. We don't really have that, so these guys are more proportionally similar across the body. It doesn't mean they don't have a lot of gut cavity space. It just means they don't appear to need huge amounts of extra gut cavity space within that. Or it might be that there are dangers to having very large gut cavity space, and we can talk about that when we start to talk about the frills and how they might be used. The food choice for these guys is a little bit unclear. So clearly they're herbivores of some sort. Food choice is a little bit hard to understand. They have a very, very strongly pointed beak, which speaks to very selective feeding, right? If you have a really strong beak, you're picking plant material as opposed to just eating everything in front of you. And that seems a little unusual for an animal that might get up to 7 tons. It seems like they should be eating lots of different stuff. Whether or not that's the case, we don't yet know. But in any case, they're probably eating lots of stuff. By the time they appear in the Cretaceous, angiosperms now exist, and so they are probably eating flowering plants. Most angiosperms, even in the late Cretaceous, are going to be smaller and not and they certainly are almost never going to be any dominant component of these ecosystems. And so that you can think of things like shrubs and low to the ground angiosperms, right? Not grass. Anything else but not grass, probably. Ferns are also certainly going to be a preferred food source. And then conifers, because they dominate forests, are going to also be commonly consumed, almost invariably, within that. one of the nice things would be if we had more gut content to look through. And we haven't talked about this yet, but the use of things like stable isotopes. So isotopes allow you to guess at where food sources are coming from, and you can work back potentially what animals might have eaten at that time. These guys are not dissimilar from the Pachies in the sense that they are not that smart. They are at least smarter than the stupidest ornithischians out there, but they are not super smart in that sense. If you're looking at the old lecture notes, I will warn you that I often move slides as I go because I find that the flow doesn't make any sense in some ways. So I set those up a while ago, and then I go back through and try to standardize them to something. So you may have to flip back and forth, but usually the slides are in there. These guys, and this is actually somewhat surprising, and we're going to talk about why that is the case too. These animals don't appear super smart. That seems sort of in contrast to some of the other facts we have about them. And certainly one of the things that intelligence would necessarily be important for is social interaction. One of the driving factors for potentially human intelligence is understanding and being in a social environment, right? It's not being the cool kid who can do physics, but it is being someone who can interact and understand how a social environment is structured to extract the best amount of resources for that person, right? And you can think of it this way too. If someone else is smarter than you, they can beat you at a contest that involves some social interaction, and that inherently breeds it's sort of a positive feedback loop. I'm smarter than you, I produce more offspring, therefore the next offspring that's smarter than me produces more offspring. You get into a situation where brain size can be increasing very rapidly just for social situations. So let's look at this guy up here. So if you can see this guy up here, this is a Pachwhinosaurus, which is a very common member, fairly well known. That's why we have these things. This down just below it, this purplish blue and the pink, yellow, and red, that's actually the brain scan of this animal. And so if you've ever taken comparative vertebrate anatomy, these yellow marked nerves are the nerves of the brain, right? You can go and find them in the shark, you can find them in the human. Those are the same brain. Those are numbers. This pink thing here is the inner ear, so that's the balance organ. You have the same thing. And then this thing down here, this red portion, is the one that we're actually concerned about, at least for these guys. That is the component of the brain that would probably be associated with behavior. And what these authors found is that the seat of higher, I'm sorry, I've been the other way. The area above that is probably associated with higher learning. The seat of higher behavioral functions, such as learning and problem solving, is actually relatively simple and stereotyped, right? So it is a very small brain, and the component that you would associate with social interactions most, right, learning and interactions in that way, is actually very poorly developed. So Pachwhinosaurus, which is, again, a fairly late member of the group, you can tell that, fully quadrupedal. The animal has lots of ornamentation on the head. This is that boss. You see that up front, that big flat area. That's very classically the boss. And yet this animal is not particularly astute in social situations. It probably has a very limited range of actions that it cycles through depending on some very simple set of rules, right? And so these guys are not apparently super smart, even though you would expect them to have a need for very strong social interactions. Let's talk about locomotion now. So one of the things that you can do with the fossils, right, when you find fossils in the ground, is you can set them up for Ceratopsians very easily. You can set them into this sprawling motion, or you can set them into an erect setup. And those are very simple to do. Part of that is because we don't have muscles and ligaments, so it's hard to know what the stress limits are, right? Often muscles and ligaments are set up to prevent some bone from moving further than it should. As soon as you remove those, it looks like the bone has enormously more movement potential. And it does to a degree, but oftentimes those movements are dangerous when they occur, so it would tend to be dangerous to have say your arm pull really, really far back, and so there need to be some sort of ligaments or muscles that tend to keep the bones in only certain directions. And then at least for these Ceratopsians, we don't necessarily know, right? Especially larger animals, it's hard to find what we would call sort of mummified bodies. So if they are erect, right, they're probably acting very much like we think of with modern mammals, where they're probably moving long distances. They can probably be relatively fast. They're probably filling those similar those similar niches within the environment. If they're sprawling, they're probably not as quick. They're probably more about staying put in one location, and that would be not dissimilar from some members within the archosaurs, right? We tend to see sprawling stances in more primitive members. These are a relatively derived group. Nice thing about it, though, of course, is that if you know what each should look like when you put the legs underneath the body, then you should just be able to look for trackways, right? Trackways look like the tracks on the left, then they're erect. If the trackways look like the tracks on the right, then the animal is actually a sprawler and would actually move out to the side. Sprawling does give you an advantage in the sense that it allows you to provide lots of power to the head. Right? If you're thrusting with the head, you want a nice wide stance to brace yourself as you do that. You don't want to have really narrow feet, because then if you tend to tilt to one side, you could easily be unbalanced and bend over in that direction. So a nice wide stance would be very useful if you're tending to use the head as sort of a battering ram. So this is a proposed. This is what Ceratopsian trackways should look like if they're erect, with the feet basically right in front of the hands right in front of the feet. If they're sprawling, you should see the hands and the feet more separate from each other. Well, we have lots of Ceratopsian trackways, so we can actually look at this stuff. The Ceratopsian trackways here, this is a trackway with a lot of different species in it, are these guys right here. And what do you see? Right, the hands are right in front of the feet, almost exactly in that position that you would expect. So they are not, in general, sprawlers, it appears. It appears, at least for long movements, they're doing that what we think of for dinosaurs, with a very erect stance with the legs directly underneath the body, which should not come as a terrible surprise. The fact that the bones don't say they can't sprawl, right, the fact that the bones allow the animal to apparently sprawl does suggest that those animals could sprawl, and that is not unsurprising either. They have these really nice head structures that look like they should be used for something, and sprawling would give you a really great opportunity to maneuver your head around, right? And that does suggest, at least, that there's something going on there. And if you talk to some people, they'll point to the back of the Triceratops skull, and you will notice that there is an enormous ball and socket joint, which gives the head a very nice 180-degree turning almost. It can swing back and forth very, very cleanly. And there aren't a lot of areas that appear to structurally limit it. So in general, we think for sprawling, okay, so they're not sprawlers. That's not really that surprising for dinosaurs. These are animals that tend to apparently spend lots of energy on being relatively fast, and that appears to be characteristic of the group, right? A lot of the features they picked up were about speed and about becoming more efficient locomotors. Erect animals are probably, therefore, a pretty good proxy for medium to large-sized herbivores on the African plain. Again, not particularly surprising. So animals like wildebeest probably function in, to some degree, very similar way to the way that Ceratopsians have functioned in the past. Speed-wise, it depends on who you talk to, but they're probably relatively quick. Probably max speeds are on the order of 30 kilometers an hour, which is really fast, right? If you're a multi-ton animal moving 30 kilometers an hour, even for short distances, that can do a lot of damage if you run into something. Probably, if you're doing long-distance movements, it's probably more of a pretty fast run to a trot for a human, but probably can sustain speeds of quite high speeds comparatively for a human over long distances in the order of 15 to 20 kilometers per hour, right? That would be really fast, but they might be able to sustain those for fairly long periods of time. Again, this sprawling is at least physically possible, so it's not to say that they aren't sprawling at least sometime, and that maybe animals are moving, and certainly animals with large frills especially may need to sprawl to get under things like woody material, right, to escape that. They may also need it for the frill itself. So this is, again, from the American Museum of Natural History. I like to show you ones that you can actually go see. But you can see this is set up as a sprawler, right, with these limbs out to the side. And to your eye, it doesn't look uncomfortable. It doesn't look terribly out of place. But probably if it's doing lots of walking, we should maneuver those legs in underneath the body, right? And what that will actually do is you'll notice that will raise the head up as well. And so that will tend to change the height at which these guys are primarily feeding from. So they're not going to be feeding right off the ground, in that case. They're going to be feeding probably a little bit higher. But if you can sprawl, you can probably also access food material that's closer at the ground level. In any case, this is a Triceratops. One of the things I do want you to just note here, or a couple things I want you to note. One is that the head is covered in a groove, and those are for blood vessels, right? So there's lots of blood vessels on the surface, which almost undoubtedly means there's keratin above it. So there's enormous amounts of keratinized surface on this head. The other thing I want you to notice is that these there aren't really a lot of bumps on the top of the head in this animal. This is a very large Triceratops, and the body itself, at least from the front here, is again, this is really impressive. This head, but the back end of the animal is not particularly different from a very generalized quadruped. Also look at the size of some of these bones too. Really enormous muscles would attach down here. These are not animals that play around with weak muscles. These are big, bulky, strong animals. For breeding, we actually have a fair amount, I should say for post-breeding. We don't actually have breeding information, right? We don't know how. At least for Ceratopsians, it seems relatively easy to imagine a male mounting a female, so that makes some sense, but we don't actually have information on that, right? We don't have any Ceratopsians locked in actual sex, so we don't actually know what it looked like, and I don't think we know of any trackways that suggest that there was breeding involved, but you could look for those kind of things, but those are probably, finding trackways is probably as close as we'll ever get to finding breeding information. In any case, we do have reproductive information. We have plenty of nests, actually. We have lots of different nests. Oftentimes, nests contain many, many, many small animals, and the small animals are therefore probably not able to leave the nest, so they're probably waiting there, and parents are probably coming back and forth to the nest. They're probably also bringing material back and forth to the nest, because unlike mammals, they don't suckle, right? So dinosaurs are not going to roll over on their side and suckle these animals, so they'd probably have to go out and collect plant material and then bring that back to the nest if these young aren't able to leave it. How are other nests made for archosaurs? So how do crocodiles make nests?
Plant material and mud.
Right. And so if that is in fact the case, so if these guys were they were certainly mounding mud to a degree. If they're also mounding plant material, it's possible that the plant material incubates the eggs, so you would have gone out and seen some area that the adult would have been protecting, and then the eggs would have been hatching from the heat of the plant material above it, and then after the animals hatched, they would have just remained within that plant material, and the adult would have continued to bring fresh plant material. Is potentially one way to explain that. Incubation is probably unlikely for Ceratopsians, and I'm going to show you why that's the case. But also, by the time you get to a quadruped that weighs 7 pounds, it's really hard to sit on eggs. So there's probably not, for those animals, probably not incubating, but no necessary guarantees on that. This is one of the older models of nesting in dinosaurs. These eggs down here are very characteristically 100% not Ceratopsian eggs. These are theropod eggs. You'll be able to identify theropod eggs very easily because theropod eggs are oblong and are asymmetrical top to bottom. So they have a narrow point and then a deep end, which is exactly like a chicken egg, which is designed so that the chicken can place the egg in the nest, push it down into the soft material of the nest, and have the egg not roll around so that the mother can sit directly on top of them. These are positioned incorrectly, right, because they're laid down on the side. That's actually not good for chicks. Mothers actually have to rotate the eggs, but they are also not Protoceratops eggs. Some other weird things about this Protoceratops. One, it's covered in these weird scales. We actually have lots of skin imprints. This is not what they look like. Two, it has really long, like really obnoxiously long toenails, like it didn't go and get its toenails clipped regularly. And the feet are really long, like really unusual, like it's trying to wear sandals or something. This is not an animal that spends lots of time running, and we know that they're relatively fast animals. So this is a very old reconstruction. This is the slow dinosaurs are reptiles. They're not doing very much, and they're stupid, right? It leaves the eggs out, and it sort of is around them, but it's eating and doing other stuff when it's there. This is not the characteristic way we think of Protoceratops today. This, however, is more likely for Protoceratops. What you have is an excavated nest. There's probably, in the live animals, there's probably plant material put over top of it. The eggs for Ceratopsians are often truly round. They look like spheres. Those are characteristic of animals that lay the eggs and then do not sit on top of them. So the eggs can move at least a little bit side to side. Those eggs look a lot like sauropod eggs, which are also very spherical frequently. This is not unusual in the size of the clutch, right? And then almost certainly there's probably an adult around, maybe both parents around. It's hard to know because bird reproduction is so variable. We go from everything with females abandoning males to males abandoning females to harem environments with multiple females to one male to multiple males with one female. There's a very, 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 very wide range of options, but there's almost certainly some form of parental care, and that, again, also speaks to why there are small animals left within the nest, right? If they can't escape the nest when they emerge, then the parent has to remain there and provide them with some sort of food until they get large enough. This is what we call ontogeny. So this is for Protoceratops where we have lots and lots of fossils. It's really easy to see this. This little guy down here is relatively young, and then this, of course, would be an adult animal. I do want you, this third skull to the from left to right, it looks like the animals get really narrow and then get big again. That is not what happens. When fossils are created, frequently they get crushed. So this animal is probably squished relative to the other skulls. It's not that they get narrow heads and get wide heads, they get narrow heads, they get wide heads. That's not what's actually happening with these guys. It's just probably an artifact of how these animals were preserved. In any case, again, this is a primitive member of the group, so it doesn't have a ton of ornamentation on the frill. Look at how small this frill is when it starts. By the time it gets to an adult, it's much, much larger. It takes up an actual larger component of the top of the head. Here, it has just two small openings. By the time you get to the large animal, you've removed actually a lot of the bone and you end up with just bone groups. So these frills are not going to be particularly strong. If you imagine an animal, let's imagine it's dead, and you walked up to it, you could easily break or destroy the frill off of the animal. So these are not going to be particularly useful in providing really strong protection to the back of the head. They could provide some, but these are not things that you are going to drop cement blocks on and watch them bounce off harmlessly as the animals run around. Already in this group too, this is again a primitive member, relatively primitive within the group. You can see that the teeth are also extremely inset.
What were the bones that came out of the cheeks called?
I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember. But they're certainly present here, right? These big, large pieces that stick out. We have to go back and look at it. Okay, so Jack Horner proposed not that long ago that Triceratops and Torosaurus may in fact be the same animal, and that Triceratops may be part of the ontogenetic sequence of Torosaurus. Torosaurus may be the adult, Triceratops may be the juvenile. And he actually proposed with a fair amount of evidence, and there is actually a lot of debate now about whether this is in fact the case. So we're going to step through that because I think it's important to recognize what makes dinosaurs different, but also to understand ontogeny within these animals, right? That there are real differences between the juveniles and the adults, and that shouldn't surprise you if the frills are used for different things or the horns are used for different things at the juvenile or a subadult stage and the adult stage, right? That really speaks to a difference in their structure. In any case, Torosaurus is on the left. Usually they have these extremely smooth frill edges, and their frills are huge. Torosaurs have some of the largest skulls just by length of any animal that's ever lived on the earth ever. They are enormously long, sometimes over 6 feet long. These are big things. These stick way out to the back. They're way more than what you need or what you think you might need to impress somebody. But the front of the head is similar. There are 3 horns, right, and they're positioned in a very similar manner over top of the head. And then on the Triceratops, it's a little bit different. You tend to have these bumps along the back, and the skull is much shorter, much shorter. That frill does not extend nearly as far back over the back of the head. This is a Triceratops ontogeny. One of the things that we know about Triceratops is we currently have no adult animals. We've never collected a fully adult Triceratops. We have plenty of juveniles, and we have these very young juveniles even. We don't have any adults yet, and we know that because the bones haven't yet fused. So these animals were still growing when they died. What you can see in Triceratops is when it's very small, it has many, 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 many more bumps within the head. But what happens is the frill continues to grow, those bumps don't really grow, and so they get further and further apart, and they also become smoother and smoother onto the back of the head, so they become relatively small within that. This up top is a Torosaurus, right, and this is your Triceratops down below. And this is very cleanly different, right? Here's a Triceratops, here's a Torosaurus. Well, the problem is we have only adult Torosaurs, so we don't have juvenile Torosaurs, but we do have nothing but juvenile Triceratops. Well, that's a real issue, right? We don't have the ontogenetic sequence of both of these groups to adulthood. And what does Torosaurus look like? Well, it looks like a Triceratops with its head stretched out, but just a frill. And if those bones on the edge of the skull are becoming less and less a component, then they should smooth out and leave you with nothing but the Torosaur skull.
But isn't the shape of the Triceratops skull completely different? Like the frill, it kind of like moves downward, whereas the Torosaur is just straight outward.
Absolutely. I agree. There are differences here in the bone shape, but bone can be remodeled very easily, and so you can change the shape relatively cleanly if you need to, as long as you're willing to build it in one way and remodel it to another. Does that make sense? So the other thing I'll show you coming up is that the Triceratops horns actually start out pointed down and they rotate up through adult. So it's going to change as you move. So that you are correct. If you just took a clip of this and said just pull it out, it would be. But actually what's happening is because bones are alive, they can be changed over time, and so there can be real differences. The other problem we have with Triceratops and Torosaurus, of course, is where do you find Torosaurus? Where do you find Triceratops? Where do you find Triceratops? In general, where do you find Torosaurus? There are very few cases where we find only Torosaurs or only Triceratops. We don't really have it. There's 3 of those as opposed to many more where they're always found in conjunction with each other. Same time period, same locations, right? So there's some issues with that. The other problem, they used the characteristics that prior authors had used to tease them apart. And what you'd like to find is, in a tree like this, all your Triceratops should group together, right? They should all be easy to pull apart by some rule. And all your Torosaurs should group together. They should all be easy to pull apart by another rule. And what they found is, unfortunately, that is not the case. What you tend to have is you have a mixed bag of Torosaurs and Triceratops, which means that there isn't one general rule to pull them apart. There are just a number of features which are generally different and a number of features which are generally not the same, right? And so those suggest, again, that you have some issues. Here's this, and they're pointing it out by phases, right? Here's a phase 1 juveniles. Oh, juveniles all Triceratops, very obviously. Phase 2 subadult. Oh, we've got at least one Torosaurus in there. Phase 3, where these are starting to be truly adult animals, we've got a spattering of Triceratops and Torosaurs mixed in. We don't have that very clean separation we'd like to see. And this is a good example, right? This is a baby Triceratops, and what you can see actually that the horn changes direction. So you can remodel the head in this case fairly cleanly without worrying too much about it. The current argument for Torosaurus and Triceratops is we haven't spent enough time getting out good characteristics, but they probably are separate species, and probably the reason we don't have lots of adult Triceratops is just luck, and probably the reason we don't have lots of baby Torosaurs is just bad luck, right? That's just the way it goes. But it doesn't necessarily mean that case is closed, and I think there's probably still a fair amount of arguing to do over that, whether those are in fact separate species or not. And certainly it suggests that, not dissimilar to what you saw in the Pachwhinosaurus, where we had a juvenile that was described as a separate species, but is probably a subadult to an already known Pachwhinosaurus, that there is probably some of that going on with Ceratopsians as well, because they're probably changing quite a bit. Horns look really defensive, right? They look really mean, but then of course, one thing you might ask is actually, are they? And of course, if they are used for fighting large animals or protecting the animal, then shouldn't the small animals have the largest horns by body size, right? If small animals need the most protection, they should have the largest horns. Conversely, if they're used just for sexual selection, it should be the inverse of that. Large animals should have really obvious horns and frills, and that's what we tend to see. Large animals tend to have really big frills, really big horns. So that suggests sexual selection as opposed to a defensive weaponry in that way. What could they be used for? Well, there's lots of things. Display is, so just so you know, even when weapons are used in combat in animals, they are used rarely in combat because animals don't want to reach that stage. Very rarely do you end up in a combat situation. Humans are no different. You don't end up at fist fights frequently. What you end up is posturing and yelling, right? You can do that. And then usually someone backs down. Very rarely do you proceed to a fist fight. It's not hard to find people arguing. It is hard to find people actually duking it out with one another. And that's because it's risky to both members. If you've ever been in a fist fight, you will know that whoever gets hit takes a lot of damage, but the person actually hitting the other person often breaks their knuckles or damages their knuckles. So there's a lot of cost to pay to even be in a fight. So these things, because they seem to be more towards the sexual selection side, are almost certainly primarily display functionality. They work to warn other animals about you. But that doesn't prevent them from being part of a combat scenario either. But you as an animal would much rather arrive, have everyone appreciate that you are the biggest, best animal out there and not fight you than that you fight everyone to prove that, right? That's a lot of energy to use up. And may also be really, really important for species recognition, right? If you have different species, it's really important for females especially, but also males, to not breed or waste time with a non-species specific animal. There are lots of reasons why species have separated, and often there are costs with breeding with animals that are not the same species as your own. Horns also come in mammals, right, in a range of different uses and sizes and purposes. Some are used for combat, some are used primarily for display, some are used for both, some are used sort of to make the animal look bigger, and there are lots of reasons to have very distinct horns. So just having horns doesn't automatically mean you should be fighting with them. This goes along with things like there are apparent differences in Protoceratops heads, but they don't really start to appear until they're about 75% of their maximum size, which strongly suggests that there's a male and female divergence at that point, which would be about right where they're reaching the sexual maturity stage, and they're starting to diverge from one another and produce very different animals in that case. There is also very strong evidence for these animals living in large herds. We have tons of bone beds which are mass accumulations of a single species. Some of them are probably from animals that drown together. So we have Pachwhinosaurus probably ended up drowning together frequently in rivers when they were migrating. So they probably were crossing rivers regularly, and there were so many animals that an animal would step on another animal, which would cause that animal to go under, which would make another animal not swim very well, which could roll under another one, which made it very difficult when these rivers were unstable and washed large numbers of animals downriver, and then they would have died at that point, and they would just wash up and be deposited together. And also the nice thing about dying altogether is that there's so much meat that oftentimes carnivores just can't go through it fast enough to end up with fossils left over. The most closely related group, of course, these Pachwhinosaurs also use their heads for display, or at least we think they do, and they appear to be doing it for sexual selection reasons. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise either that the Ceratopsians are probably also dealing with this as well. And I'm going to just go through this, and then you guys can go. There are also apparently, following the same rules we did with pathology in the Pachys, you can look for pathologies in the Ceratopsians, and you can find wounds in the frills. So we're going to look at two pathologies, or two different species for pathologies. One are the Centrosaurs. Centrosaurs really don't have bones over the or horns over the eyes to speak of. They're small and they're probably relatively blunt, but they do have extremely large central snout horns. Triceratops is the other one we're going to look at. We have a fair number of them. These animals do have three horns, very distinctly three horns, and they have two very, very large ones under the eyes. So if they're using their heads in combat, the wounds they receive on those frills should be very, very different, because Centrosaur heads physically don't fit together the same way that Triceratops heads do. This is one way you can imagine it, right? Triceratops are probably locking at a slight angle so that the horns tend to touch only in certain areas of the skull. You can note that it's down here, underneath and behind the eye, and then above and behind the head entirely. Centrosaurs are probably more fighting like the one above, where there's a physical body push side to side, and less so with a direct on-to-on, because if they went straight on with each other, they would either have a very difficult time locking together, right? They would be very hard to keep one horn side to side, or they would puncture through the bone of the other animal into the skull, and neither animal really wants to do that, partially because your bone can get stuck and then you can die, but also partially because that's a real risk for you as well, that you might get punctured and killed. So this is what you see in Triceratops, as you'd expect, because there's not going to be a lot of horn touching at the front. Things like the nasal bones, there are no pathologies that we currently know of. But the jugal bone, the squamosal bone, and a bit on the parietal bone do have a lot of pathologies, and that's where those heads should be locking together. So you should have the nose horn touching the jugal bone and causing damages, and you should have the longer horns touching things like the squamosal bone and causing damages back there. if you compare that to the Centrosaur, you'll see that there is some damages to these animals. These numbers are actually a little bit larger, so the actual number of animals here proportionally is not that much different. But you really don't see very much damage to the back of the head, right? The parietal and the squamosal really don't have those damages. If anything, they're at the jugal, and that would be where animals might abut one another and push off. So that suggests that there's some real differences between them. We also know that Centrosaurs tend to have lots of broken ribs, and that may be because they tend to hit each other in the side of the body as opposed to head on. So these guys are probably fighting in one way. So animals with one horn or bosses are probably fighting in a very distinct style, ritualized style. Triceratops and other three-horned and two-horned animals are probably doing it in a very another way, right? And so the divergence between these groups may actually be how the heads align with each other in combat, and that may split groups out. Here's some of those pathologies, right? These are really clearly lines. It's like somebody took something sharp and scraped it across the bone, which is exactly what you would expect if a horn contacted a point and then scraped down across the bone. So and they're healed, right? So these animals are surviving these contacts, although their frills would be bloodied. They probably have a protective sheath of keratin over top to prevent themselves from taking lots of bone damage, but they're still taking damage anyway. Okay, so that's going to do it for the Ceratopsians. I know we're over by just a minute. Next lecture, we're going to deal with the Ornithopoda. We're going to be done with the really cool frilled animals, unfortunately, but we are going to deal with groups I think that we have a lot of very interesting data for, and the Ornithopodians are really some of the most successful terrestrial herbivores that have ever existed.